Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Among his essays, Michel de Montaigne has one that is titled On Cato the Younger, and you would expect it would be all about Cato, but he only really gets to discussing him about midway through the essay, which is fairly short, by the way. He begins with a very interesting set of reflections about how people engage in judgment and you might say, lenses that they, whether consciously or not, bring to it. And he talks about a common error or failing of judging another person by oneself. So he says, I can easily believe others have qualities quite distinct from my own. Just because I feel I'm pledged to my individual form, I don't bind all others to it as everyone else typically does. I can conceive and believe there are thousands of different ways of living, and contrary to most people, I readily acknowledge our differences more easily than our similarities. So what is he saying there? Listen, we've got a lot of different ways of living, of arranging our lives, our relationships, of understanding things. I'm not going to say that my way of doing things is the pattern for everybody else, nor am I going to take one other single person and make them into the absolute pattern. He goes on and he says that I am as ready as you may wish to relieve another human being of my attributes and basic qualities and contemplate him simply as he is, free from comparisons, and sculpting him after his own model, right? And a little bit later, he's going to say that each person should be judged apart from others, à part soi, on their own account, you might say. And that conclusions about himself, Montaigne, should not be drawn from typical or commune, right, examples that are provided by other people. And so he's going to give a few examples here. He says, listen, I'm not sexually continent, but that doesn't stop me from acknowledging the continence of the feuilletons and capuchins, nor from thinking well of their way of life. It's just not for me. I like actually having sex, and I can see that, it's important to them to not be doing that. They're going to spend their life, involved with God, so maybe they shouldn't be doing the sorts of things that I do. It's a very enlightened attitude, we might say here. And so going on, he says, my own weakness in no way affects the opinion which I would have of the strength and vigor of those who merit it. And that's where we're going to start getting to Cato, right? This really important Roman politician, soldier, philosopher embodying Stoicism. Some people think he may, in fact, have been a Stoic sage. And he says that, I may crawl in earthly slime, but that doesn't mean that I don't see way up in the clouds, the matchless height of certain heroic souls. And he says, now that's not what most people do. They go by the people that they see in front of them and themselves, right? And we live in a time that's not as good as previous times. He says the current times that we're living in are pretty debased, pretty corrupt, And he says that it's so leaden it lacks not only the practice of virtue, but even the very idea of it. Virtue seems to be no more than scholastic jargon, right? And he says it's a thing to hang up in a display case or have dangling from your tongue, just as an earring dangles from your ear. So people are still talking about virtue, but they're not living it out, and they don't really believe in it, most of them. So what is going to be the case if that is the situation? Well, he says that when it comes to all these things that we care about with respect to virtue, actions, the essence of it, motives, we're not seeing it. So he says, virtuous actions are no longer there to be recognized. Those which have the face of virtue, or the image, the visage of virtue, don't have its essence. And then he talks about motive, right? He says, we're led to do them from profit, reputation, fear, custom, and other similar motives. Justice, valor, and graciousness that we practice can then be termed in the view of others from the face they put on in the public, but they're by no means virtuous to the doer because a different end was aimed at. If you're being just, and you're only being just to get a good reputation or avoid getting in trouble, you're not really just, right? Same thing with generosity or others. And so what does this end up leading to? So he says that it's very common in our time, meaning in the time that he's writing, I think this applies to our time as well, that our judgments are going to be following the depravity of our morals. We assume that everybody's as bad as we are, that if they talk about moral goodness or virtue, they're probably putting that on. They're trying to get over on somebody. They're trying to stay out of trouble. They don't really mean it. Why? Because we don't. And Montaigne says, that's not a proper inference, right? So he goes on and he says that, we see this happening all the time. Our judgments are sick. The majority of ingenious men in my time are as clever at besmirching the glory of the fair and great-souled actions of ancient time, foisting some base interpretation on them, and devising frivolous causes and occasions for them, right? So they don't like there to be great people to look up to. They need to bring them down to their level. They just don't believe that people are as good as they're depicted. And, in some cases that might be true, right? We do find out every once in a while that a great revered figure turns out to be a scumbag, or at least just, not all that consistently good. But does that mean that we can say that none of them are, that it's all hypocrisy, it's all put on? Well, he says, at least with one person, Cato, we can look up to him, right? He says that Cato was subject to this as well. Plutarch, so we're talking about ancient times, Plutarch states that some men in his time attributed the death of Cato the Younger to his fear of Caesar. Now, what's going on there? So Cato, along with some other important people like Marcus Tullius Cicero, fought against Caesar in the Roman Civil War on the side of Pompey. They didn't immediately join Pompey because Caesar was kind of a scumbag and Pompey was kind of a scumbag. And especially for Cato, he was like, what's a Stoic to do? And eventually he's like, well, pick the lesser of two evils. I'll fight against Caesar. Now, when Caesar won, he was willing to be clement or merciful to the people who had fought against him. Cato thought that he would essentially be used as a propaganda tool on the part of Caesar to help solidify Caesar's reign as a despot, as a dictator, undoing the Roman Republic. So Cato killed himself instead and wouldn't allow himself to be used that way. So maybe Cato was really afraid. No, Cato killed himself because of a matter of principle. But there's always people that are ready to say, oh, no. It is because he was actually afraid to engage in detraction, pulling something down, right? This made Plutarch angry. And Montaigne says, by which one can judge how much more indignant he would have been at those who attributed it to ambition. And he says, idiots! Cato would rather have done a fair and noble deed which brought him shame than glory. And he says that with Cato, at least, he is a model, actually a patron, right? A model that nature took on, chose, brought forth to us to show how far virtue and fortitude. Now you might say, wait a second, isn't fortitude the same thing as courage? Isn't that one of the virtues? So the French word here is fermeté, a sort of consistency. So we might think of virtue and following through on things, how far those can reach or go, right? Cato is providing us with a model. And then he says, I'm not up to treating so rich a subject here. I just want to make some verses. And now we're going to get a little bit of a discussion about poetry from 5 Latin poets who rival each other in their praise of Cato, both in the interest of Cato and also secondarily in their own, because it makes them look good as poets, right? And he says, a well-educated person will find the first 2 feeble compared to the third more young and vigorous, but ruined by its own excessive power. And we reach the 4th, at which point he'll clap his hands in wonder. And when he comes to the final one, which outdistances the others, he will be thunderstruck and moved to ecstasy. And we'll come to those verses in just a moment. But he's got a little bit of a digression about poetry. He says, we have far more poets than judges and connoisseurs of poetry. It's far easier to write poetry than to appreciate it. Now, to appreciate it, to understand it, to get it, you could say, connaître, right? The old spelling of connaître, to know by acquaintance, we could say. And he says, at a low level, you can judge it by rules of art. That's fine. Roses are red, violets are blue, blah, 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 blah. It's a poem. It rhymes. It's got a good, meter to it. It conveys some interesting ideas or something like that. But when it comes to real good poetry, something different happens. He says that divine poetry is above reason and rules. We can't actually provide frameworks for judging it. We just kind of have to get it. He says, whoever can distinguish its beauties with a firm and subtle gaze does not see it at all, any more than we can see the brilliance of a flash of lightning. It doesn't exercise our judgment. If it did, then we could share that with others. It ravishes it and enraptures it. And he says, it can more easily be seen in the theater that the sacred inspiration of the muses, having first seized the poet with anger, grief, or hatred, and driven him outside of himself, affects the actor through the poet and then the entire audience. Needle hanging from needle, each one attracting the other in the chain. Drawn from Plato's Ion, is it not, right? And so he's going to talk about the variety of poetic forms. He says that poetry has had the power to transpierce and transport me. I've been variously affected by the variety of poetic forms, not in terms of higher and lower, but a difference of luster. First came a gay and genial flowing, then a keen and sublime subtlety, finally a ripe and constant power. And he says, who do I have in mind? Ovid, Lucan, Virgil. And he's actually going to close with Virgil. So who do we actually have in our poems about Cato? The first is Martial, who says, let Cato while he lives be greater even than Caesar. And I'll read you the Latin here. Sit Cato dum vivit sana vel Caesare major, right? The next one is Manlius, who says, then undefeated, death-defying Cato. Now, Montaigne is saying, these are okay, not great. The third one is better, but still flawed. The third one is by Lucan in his Pharsalia, and it runs, the cause of the victors pleased the gods, that of the vanquished, Cato. Now, that's getting sublime, right? The cause of the victors please the gods. Caesar wins. Cato is even setting himself in a certain way above the gods by favoring the vanquished. Then the fourth is praising Caesar, but in a certain way taking something away from that. And this is by Horace. The whole world conquered except for the unyielding soul of Cato. So it's saying something about this guy. And then finally, the one that Montaigne thinks is the best is from Virgil, and it runs, and then a law to them all, Cato. And that goes back to this idea about providing us with an example of what it is that a human being could actually be like. And coming back to our first discussion in this, somebody might come along and be like, oh, Cato, he wasn't that good, because I'm not that good. I can't imagine anyone actually being that good in reality, in a historical setting. It's fine to be in stories and stuff like that, but nobody's actually that good. And Montaigne is saying, you're judging him on the basis of your own ideas about human beings drawn solely from you and all the scumbags that you surround yourself with, right? It is possible for somebody to be genuinely good, and for Montaigne, if anybody actually attained to that, it's Cato.